Hi there, it's Cynthia from Yarniversity, and today I wanted to show you how to do the provisional cast on. I use this cast on a lot, especially when designing or, running short of yarn or the potential to run short of yarn. So I'm going to show you how to do a provisional cast on today and how to take it out later. All right, I'm ready to begin. I'm going to use this Rowan Summerlight 4-ply for my provisional cast on. I like to use something that is a plant fiber because it is smooth and it's not sticky. So when I go to make my yoga socks with my Rowan sock yarn, it won't, when I pull this out, it won't stick to the fiber. So that's what I'm going to use for my provisional cast on. And I also have a crochet hook and I have some double pointed needles. I'm going to cast onto the double pointed needles and then transfer my stitches around. So I'll be casting on all of my stitches, I hope, onto one DPN. To begin the provisional cast on with my cotton yarn, I'm going to start with a slip knot. And I will place that slip knot onto the neck of my crochet hook. It doesn't really matter what size crochet hook you need for a provisional cast on, i.e. where you're going to pull it out later. Gauge isn't important in my opinion. So my knitting needles here, I'll move those out of the way. My knitting needles are 2.5 millimeter knitting needles. My crochet hook is actually a 4 millimeter crochet hook, but again, size doesn't matter, gauge doesn't matter for the provisional cast on. I've put that slip knot onto my crochet hook and I'm keeping it fairly loose. I want to be able to pull that hook through there. I don't want it to be too big, but I don't want it to be tight either. So try to make your slip knot and all the stitches that you pull through your crochet hook, slidable on the neck of your crochet hook. Position your crochet hook in your dominant hand. So I'm right-handed. I'm going to hold the crochet hook in my right hand, but you could easily put it in your left hand. This is not and there's no handedness issue in doing this. Your knitting needle you're going to hold next to the crochet hook in your other hand, and the yarn coming off the crochet hook is going to go underneath the knitting needle. So I'm going to hold the yarn in my left hand. I've got my crochet hook in my right hand, but again, those hands and tools could be reversed. There's no problem at all with doing it that way. What's important is that the slip knot's on your crochet hook, the knitting needle is sitting above the yarn and next to the crochet hook. We're going to take the crochet hook and we're going to go over top of the knitting needle, and we're going to go and catch the yarn on the other side of the knitting needle and bring it through that loop on the neck of the crochet hook. So I'm taking my crochet hook and going over top of the knitting needle. I'm putting it underneath the yarn, and I'm pulling that yarn back across the top of the knitting needle and through the loop that was on the neck of my crochet hook. Now I'm going to take the yarn that I'm using to work my crocheted chain, and I'm going to put it underneath the knitting needle. So the yarn's coming in between my two implements and underneath the knitting needle. And then I can take my crochet hook and go over top of the knitting needle, grab the yarn from the other side of it, and pull it through the loop that was on my crochet hook. So I've just done 2 crochet chains onto my knitting needle. Again, I'm going to take this yarn, the working yarn, and pull it underneath the knitting needle. So I'm taking it in between my crochet hook and knitting needle and making sure that it's laying underneath the knitting needle. Then with the crochet hook, I go over top of the knitting needle, grab the yarn with my crochet hook and pull it back through the loop on my crochet hook. So again, yarn goes underneath the knitting needle. The crochet hook goes over top of the knitting needle. I put it underneath the yarn and I swirl the crochet hook so that the hook part points down, and that makes it easier to pull through the loop that's on the neck of the crochet hook. Let me do that again. So the yarn goes underneath the knitting needle. My crochet hook goes over top of the knitting needle. underneath the yarn, and I swirl the crochet hook so that the hook part points down towards the ground, and that makes it easier to pull through the loop that's on my crochet hook. The other thing that makes it easy to pull through is if I don't tighten this up. So if I were to pull on that, on my yarn, on my working yarn, and it tightens up the yarn on my crochet hook, it becomes very difficult to pull anything through there. So keep your tension loose on your crochet hook. Again, not sloppy loose, but not overly tight either. All right. So my two implements are side by side, they're parallel. I take the crochet hook and I make it perpendicular to the knitting needle. I grab the yarn, swirl the hook, pull it through the loop, and repeat. I'm going to do this more times than the number of stitches I actually want to cast on. So I'm going to continue to work on my crocheted provisional cast on, and then I'll stop and count in a bit. So you can see that once you get good at it, you can cast on fairly quickly. Now, the point of this cast on for me today is to pull it out later. You could do this cast on and integrate it into your knitting, and then gauge would be more important. But because I'm going to pull it out later and regain the stitches so that I can knit in the other direction, gauge itself doesn't matter. So I can crochet on loosely, I can use a bigger crochet hook, that's just fine. And I don't have to count until I'm good and ready, but I do want to cast on a few more stitches than I will actually need. I usually cast on 3 to 5 additional stitches. So I'm casting on, I need 64 stitches for my yoga sock that I'm planning to make. And the reason I'm doing a provisional cast on is because I'm going to make the body of the sock first, and then I'll come back and I'll add on some edging. So imagine, if you did this in a sweater, let's say you were worried about running out of yarn, and so you knit the body of the sweater, and then you wanted to come back and, do the hem or the cuff of the sweater, the bottom of the sweater, with a different yarn, a different color of the same yarn, for example, because you'd run out. You could free up those stitches, put them back on the needle, and knit your ribbing after you've finished the body of the sweater. That's one of the reasons why I think this provisional cast on is so cool. I'm going to count. Okay, so there's the number of stitches I need. I'm going to cast on 3 more. And then I'm going to cut my yarn. So then I'll cut my yarn, and I'm just going to pull that yarn tail through. Okay, so it's just coming off the end, nothing bad's happening there. And then I'll take those last 3 stitches and I'll just pop them off the end of the needle. These 3 chains here will tell me that this is the end that I will unravel from later on. So I have 2 tails. One is just a plain tail like this, and the other has 3 chains on it that I just popped off the end of the needle, and that is what Lucy Neatbee likes to call the unravelable end. So that's an indication that you can unravel from this end. Now I've got my provisional cast on my needle, and so now I'm going to divide my stitches up. And again, I find this is a really helpful cast on if you're working in the round and you are working on double pointed needles, because you know how tricky it is to get those needles joined in the round. And I find that this method really helps. So I'm going to split my stitches up over 3 needles. Okay, so in my case, I put 20 stitches here and 20 stitches here. I'm just going to count. I should have 24 here. I do. Okay. So there are my this is my cast on, and I'm going to start getting knitting. I'm going to start knitting in the round. It doesn't matter if I start from this end or from this end. Whichever end you want to begin with, if you're working in the round, in this case, doesn't matter. So I'm just going to pick up I'm going to pick up a knitting needle. I'm going to make sure that all these stitches are moved into the center, because when I pick it up, I don't want anything to fall. And I'm just going to begin with a plain old simple knit stitch. So I've just taken my yarn and I've kind of folded it over, and I'm pulling that loop through the first stitch on my provisional cast on. And then I'm going to find the working end of the yarn, and I'm just going to knit all the way around. And I'm not going to worry about, twisting or anything like that. I'm not going to join it in the round until I've got the first row of knitting done. Now, if you're working flat on a straight needle, it's exactly the same thing. You'll just begin at the end that presents itself to you at the pointy end of the needle, and you'll start knitting. Now, it's important to work your first row after a provisional cast on with either all knits or all purls. And that's because if you alternate knits and purls on your provisional cast on, you won't be able to pull it out smoothly. There'll be some picking out that happens. So even if your pattern was, seed stitch or moss stitch or rib stitch, work the first row after your provisional cast on in just plain knits or purls. So one of my crochet chain stitches fell off my needle there, and you can see that there is a big loop that's presenting itself, and maybe you can kind of see two smaller loops along the bottom, the chain along the bottom. So I'm going to put that big loop back on my needle and knit it. So if your crochet chain falls off your falls off your needle, I should say, as you're working it, don't worry about it. It's pretty apparent which loop needs to go back on the needle, because you've made the loops around the needle much bigger than the chain that's going underneath the knitting needle. And just pop one off there again so you can see there's even if I were to pull on it, you can see that that top loop stays fairly big. And I've just split this one here. So I'm going to grab that loop, put it back onto my left hand needle, and continue to knit on the edge. Okay, I've got my first row of knitting done. And so I want to show you, I've got some swirly stuff happening here. So if you were working flat, you wouldn't have this. Obviously, you'd be working on one straight needle, and you would just turn your work and purl back. But if you're working in the round, we're just going to take a moment here to make sure that there are no twists in the cast on edge. So we want the cast on edge to be facing inside. And because I've used a contrasting color, it makes it very easy to find where that twist is hiding. You can see it, scampering around the needle, and to kind of make it behave better, because I've got this extra row of knitting on the needle itself. So once I'm assured that there's no twisting left, so all of my cast on edge is facing inside my little triangle here, I'll pick up my empty needle. I'm going to drop everything here because there's just a lot of tails. I'm taking the needle with the two short tails, and I'm putting that in my left hand, and I'm taking the empty needle and I'm inserting it into that first stitch. And I'm kind of holding those two tails to the back here between my fingers, because this first tail doesn't have a lot of anchor to it. I just looped that. That was the one that was just a loop to begin with. So I'm going to give it a little bit of anchoring by holding it there. And then I'm going to go and find the other end of my knitting, the one that's attached, the yarn that's attached to the ball, and I'm going to bring it around and wrap it over the back of the needle and pull it through that stitch. I've got my index finger sort of pressed against the back of this left-hand needle to keep everything in place. And after I've made that stitch, I'll give this yarn a little tug. And then I'll make the next stitch. And after I've made the next stitch, I'll give the yarn a little tug. And so I'm just going to knit another round with my provisional cast on. And I want you to know that if you were doing something like a rib stitch, you could do that now. So once you've got one round of plain knitting after your provisional cast on, you can go into any kind of stitch pattern that you like. Rib stitch, seed stitch, moss stitch, right? So I'm going to complete my round here, and then I'm going to do one more check to make sure there are no twists in my circular knitting. Right, so here I'm coming up to the end of my second round of knitting on my double pointed needles. And I'm just going to make sure that my stitches aren't twisted. So it looks like maybe there's a little bit of a twist here. I'm just going to straighten it out. And I can see that, again, my provisional cast on, it's a little roughly, but it's all facing the inside of my work. So it's fine. There's no twist in there. If I did end up with a twist, you can untwist it at this point and you can move that twist into the little piece of yarn that is connecting the first row together. So when you began the second row of knitting, you joined in the round, and you can move your twist, you can move your stitches around and move that any twist that you have around your needle, you can straighten it out and move it into this little bar here. But mine is free and clear, so I'm going to continue working in the round. And again, when you first get joined up, you may end up with a little bar of yarn there, and that may worry you a little bit. And I'm going to tell you, don't worry about it. It's going to be just fine. So after you make the first stitch, again, give it a little pull. After you make the second stitch, give it a tighter pull, and then for the rest of the stitches on each of your double pointed needles, you can just work your regular tension. It'll be fine. All right, I'm going to work away on my sample, and then I will come back and show you how the provisional cast on can be removed. All right, so here we are. I have transferred my stitches that I was working on to a piece of cord to keep them out of the way. And here is my provisional cast on. I'm going to put my provisional cast on back onto my double pointed needles so I can knit in the other direction. I'm going to begin by finding the end of the provisional cast on where I had those extra 3 chains. And I'm going to undo that last chain. Go and pull on it, and you'll see that it just kind of unzips as we go along. So now when I get to, here we go, when I get to the point where I've got the yarn coming through the stitch here, I'm going to take my double pointed needle or whatever needle you like, and I'm going to transfer this stitch where the yarn's coming through onto my knitting needle. And then I will again just tease the yarn out of the way here. Pull it through that stitch. There we go. And then, oops, pop that back in there. This needle fell out of that one stitch that was there. And now I'm going to hold up my crochet chain so that I can see the stitch in the row below. Do you see it there? Do you see the stitch that's sort of attached to my crochet chain there? I'm going to pop my needle in from the back to the front into that stitch, and then I'm going to pull on my crochet chain. I'm going to pull the crochet chain out of that stitch, and then holding on to the loop up here, I'm going to give my provisional cast on a little pull just to tighten things up. I'll stick my needle into the stitch that is held by my provisional cast on from the back to the front, and then I'll pull on the tail of my provisional cast on to pull that loop free. So I'm doing this one stitch at a time because my stitches are pretty tiny, and I could pull this out and pull everything free. I'll do that here, but you'll see that because my stitch is so tiny, I kind of lose the opportunity, there it is, to get it onto my needle nicely from the back, which is to put it on with the right side, the right leg facing me. So it's easier if I hold on to this loop, which is the provisional cast on, and I can pull on it to free up that stitch underneath, stick my knitting needle in from the back to the front, and then find the little tail and pull on it. And in this manner, I can put all my stitches back on the needle with the right leg facing, which just means that it's going to be in the right position to knit. And that's really all there is to putting your provisional, taking out your provisional cast on and putting the stitches back on the needles. You can see why, in this case, it's handy to have a yarn that's easy to pull out. Something that's smooth and doesn't stick, because, again, with these stitches are so tiny, you can imagine what it'd be like if I had to, tug at anything and kind of get them apart. Right, I'm getting to the end here now. Just have a few more stitches to pop back on my needles. Go. Perfect. Okay, so I love this because it gives you so many possibilities. Imagine that this was a sleeve that you knit for your sweater and you wanted to work your cuff later on, so that you could make your sleeve as long as you wanted. A provisional cast on means you could knit your sleeve from the cuff up and then come back later and finish your cuff. I could turn this into a pair of mittens or a sock or a yoga sock or whatever I like. I've got both ends that I can work from. So that's removing a provisional cast on and putting one in. I hope you enjoyed the video.